this lecture, we're going to learn about anonymous namespaces. And these are namespaces that don't have explicit names in our code. And here is a simple example of how you can do that. You just say namespace, you say the curly braces here, but you don't specify the name for the namespace. And the things we have inside our namespace here are going to be accessible without specifying the namespace name as you see here. For example, we can call this add function here, and we're going to have access to this. If you have multiple declarations for an anonymous namespace like we have here, for example, we have one on top and we have another below the main function, these are not going to be separate namespaces. They are going to be the same namespace, but what we have below is just going to be an extension of the namespace we have on top here. So note that they are not going to be different namespaces. And because they are basically the same namespace, we have a declaration on top and we have a definition for our add function in the namespace below here. But anonymous namespaces have a few things you need to be aware of, and we're going to look at them here. The first is that when the compiler sees an anonymous namespace declared in your code, it is going to generate an internal name for your namespace. So what is going to happen is basically something like this. In file1.cpp, we have a namespace which is anonymous. In file2, we also have an anonymous namespace. What the compiler is going to do behind the scenes is to generate names for these namespaces. So for example, for file 1 here, we might have a namespace like this. For file 2, we might have a namespace like this. But one thing you should know is that you don't have access to these names here. These are for use by the compiler. And a direct consequence of this is that anonymous namespaces can only be used in the translation unit where they are declared. Or to say this in other words, things you declare in an anonymous namespaces are only going to be usable in the translation unit where they were declared. And you should really note this. And we're going to see an example of this in a minute when we hit Visual Studio Code, but you should really keep this clear in your mind. Okay, the generated unique namespace name is not accessible to you, the developer, so you can't use that name. It is for use by the compiler. And there can only be one anonymous namespace for a single translation unit. If you set up multiple anonymous namespaces blocks, they just be extensions for the first one, and we have talked about this. Anonymous namespaces in different translation units are completely separate, and the compiler is just going to generate different namespaces for these guys. And because you don't have access to the compiler-generated namespace, the things you declare inside the namespace are only going to be accessible in the translation unit where they were declared. This is what we just said, but I really want you to keep this in mind. Okay, we have seen the syntax to declare anonymous namespaces, and we know that names inside an anonymous namespace are only going to be reachable and usable from the translation unit where they were declared. And it is time we headed over to Visual Studio Code and played with us a little more. Okay, here we are in our working folder. The current project is Anonymous Namespaces. We're going to grab our template files. We're going to put them in place. Let's do that. And we're going to open this little guy in Visual Studio Code by dragging and dropping here. And we're going to have our main CPP file. We can close the left sidebar. We don't need that anymore. And we're going to play a little bit. We're going to set up an add function, double add. It's going to add up two parameters, double A and double B. And this function is going to live inside an anonymous namespace. So we're going to say namespace, and we're not going to specify the name for this namespace. We're just going to say namespace here. I think we can bring this guy to the top. That's what I like. And we're going to bring this inside our namespace here. And this is the syntax for an anonymous namespace. You say namespace, you don't specify the name, and you put your curly braces, and you put whatever you want to put inside your namespace here. In this case, we are putting in the declaration for our add function. We can also put the definition of this little guy below the main function, and it is going to live inside the namespace here but this is going to be a definition, so we're going to put a pair of curly braces and we're going to return A plus B because that's what we want to do here. Now, how do we call this function? We know it is living inside a namespace. The compiler is going to generate a name for this namespace, but we don't have access to that name. To call this function, all we have to do is say add. Let's do double result equals add and say 10.1 and 20.2. We can do that. And we're going to see what we get from the compiler. Let's put a semicolon there. And we can print the result out. We can say std cout result. And we're going to say result here. Okay, so what do we get? Let's try and build this program. We're going to build successfully. We can clear and run Rooster by bringing up a terminal here. Let's bring up a terminal. And we're going to clear and run Rooster. We're going to see that the result is going to be what we expect, 30.4. So what this is really doing, it's making this function behave as if it was declared in the global namespace, because we are able to call it like this. So, but that magic is going to be done by the compiler to make this function accessible here. But one thing you should know is that things you declare inside anonymous namespaces like this are only going to be usable in the translation unit where they were declared. And that's really important. To bring this point home, I am going to add another translation unit, maybe call this some other file. Why not? And it's going to be a CPP file. And we're going to set up an anonymous namespace with a definition for this function here. We can copy this and comment this out to take this out of the main CPP file. And we're going to paste that little guy here. And we note that when the compiler sees a call to this function, it is going to see a declaration inside this namespace. So this is going to compile. But once we hit the link stage, the linker is going to look for the definition of this function. It's going to look in this translation unit. It's not going to find it. It's going to look in this translation unit. It's going to see this add function. This is a definition, but this definition is only accessible from the translation unit where it is defined. And this happens to be a separate translation unit. So the compiler is not going to find this. This is only usable in the some other file translation unit. So this is not going to work, and we are going to get a linker error. Let's try and build this because I want you to see this. We're going to run the task to build with GCC, and the build should fail. You're going to see build finished with errors, and we have an undefined reference to add double, which is living in an anonymous namespace. So you really should see this, and this is a problem. This should prove that things that you declare inside anonymous namespaces are only usable and accessible from the translation unit where they were declared. The function we have here is only usable in this translation unit. If we go down here and, for example, say void do something, and we go inside and call add and specify 1 and 2, for example. So if this function was declared in the main function like we did before, this should work just fine, because now we are trying to use this function from the translation unit where it was declared and defined here. If we do this, you're going to see that this is going to work. Let's build again to make sure this works. We have no typo. This is building successfully. We can clear and run Rooster, and this is working just fine. This is really all I had to share in this lecture, showing you the syntax you can use to set up anonymous namespaces. Please note that the compiler is going to generate a name for these namespaces, but the name is not going to be accessible to you in your code. A direct consequence of that is that things you declare inside your anonymous namespace are going to be only usable and reachable from the translation unit where you declare them. And they are going to be accessible because the compiler is going to do some magic and make them feel like they were declared in the global namespace. And we can access these names directly without using a namespace prefix like we have been doing before. We are going to stop here in this lecture. In the next one, we're going to learn about nested namespaces. Go ahead and finish up here and meet me there.